This is critical thinking on digestive physiology, and here are the questions. This is the first one, the second one, the third, and the fourth. So let's look at the first question, which asks you, what are the consequences of decreased salivary secretion? So the first choice is increased bacterial activity. This does happen whenever there is decreased salivary secretion, because if you remember, saliva has lysozymes which are bacteriostatic, which means they inhibit bacterial activity. So if there is decreased secretion, naturally the bacterial activity can continue without any hindrance. So this is true. The second one is difficulty swallowing. This also will be true because saliva contains mucus, especially from the sublingual and the submandibular glands, and mucus lubricates and helps you to swallow. So if the salivary secretion is less, which happens when your mouth is dry, you do find it difficult to swallow. The third choice, which says no carbohydrate digestion is possible. Now this is false, because while carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth due to salivary amylase, if saliva is less, if the amount of salivary secretion is less, it does not mean that there will be no carbohydrate digestion at all, because pancreatic amylase is also there, which helps in carbohydrate digestion. So pancreatic amylase, which is present in the duodenum, that will continue with carbohydrate digestion. So this part is wrong. So hence, since these two are correct, the correct answer would be 1 and 2, which is the fourth choice. Now let's go to the next question, where you're asked to identify the true statement. So let's look at all these choices. The first one is that glycogenesis will cause blood glucose levels to increase. Now this is false, because glycogenesis means that glycogen is being synthesized. Glycogen is synthesized when there is a lot of carbohydrate present, and when there is excess carbohydrate, some of it of course is in the form of glucose, but the excess is converted to glycogen. So when it is converted to glycogen, the blood glucose levels will not rise, because you're taking glucose and you're actually converting this glucose into glycogen. So this way, in the opposite direction. Glycogenolysis, when glycogen is broken down, that will cause blood glucose levels to increase. So this statement is not true. In fact, glycogenesis, whenever you have the word genesis, this means this is an anabolic reaction. So in this case, you can see that glycogen is being produced. It's produced from glucose, and hence blood glucose levels will not increase. The second one is a person with liver disease will have pernicious anemia. This is also false, because pernicious anemia occurs when there is lack of intrinsic factor, an intrinsic factor is required for the absorption of vitamin B12. So either there is a lack of intrinsic factor, or for some reason vitamin B12 is not being absorbed by the body. A person with liver disease will have bleeding tendencies, because if you remember, the liver produces thrombopoietin, and it also produces a whole lot of clotting factors. It's responsible for producing clotting factors. So if there is liver disease, then it cannot function normally. So thrombopoietin, which is responsible for the production of platelets, and then clotting factors are not being produced. So the person will have bleeding tendencies and not pernicious anemia. Let's look at the third statement, which is the stimulus for secretion of intestinal juice is through stretching of the wall and chemical nature of the food. This is true, because the stimulus for secretion of any of the juices, be it gastric juice or intestinal juice, is through the nervous system. So there is stimulation through the nervous system and through hormones or any other substances, for example, histamine for HCl. But here we take nervous system and hormones. And the nervous system is primarily stimulated through stretching of the wall, so that which is due to distension. So when food enters an organ, for example, when chyme enters the duodenum and then the rest of the small intestine, the wall is stretched. So if this was the initial caliber of the wall, when chyme enters it, it stretches the wall. And that the mechanoreceptors in the wall then stimulate the nervous system, which brings about secretion of the juice. In this case, it's intestinal juice. Chemical nature of the food, for example, the decreased pH because of acidic chyme or other substances which are present, they cause secretion from the hormones. They cause hormonal secretion. Those hormones then go and act on the cells and cause intestinal juice to be secreted. So this statement is therefore true. And this is true, as I said, for secretion of juices even from the stomach. The distension, which acts on the nervous system, and the chemical nature, which acts on the hormones, and both of them bring about secretion of the juices. The fourth statement, which is receptors in the digestive tract, which bring about digestive activity, are seen in the submucosal glands. Now, this is false, and the receptors are seen in the walls. And these were the receptors I was talking about in the previous statement. The mechanoreceptors, which are the stretch receptors, which act primarily on the nervous system. Then you have the chemoreceptors and the osmoreceptors, which act on the nervous system too, but primarily act on the hormone cells. So these are not seen in the glands, but they are seen in the walls of the digestive tract. So this is false. And the last statement, which says a newborn child's GI tract will not manufacture vitamin E and vitamin B complex. Now, this is also false, because while a newborn child's GI tract will not manufacture vitamin B complex, and that is because it does not have those symbiotic bacteria in the large intestine, it will not manufacture vitamin K. So vitamin K and vitamin B complex are manufactured by those bacteria, and since a newborn child's GI tract is sterile, that's what they will not manufacture. It's not vitamin E. So hence this statement is false, because while part of it is true, those bacteria do not produce vitamin E. They produce vitamin K. And as I said, a newborn child's GI tract is sterile, and hence they won't produce B and vitamin B complex and K, and it's not vitamin E. So this statement is false, and the only true statement is the third one. Now let's look at the next question, which asks you to identify the incorrect statement. So let's look at the first one, which says uncontrolled diabetes can lead to ketoacidosis due to an excess breakdown of fats. This is true, because in diabetes, since the diabetic person, and if it's uncontrolled, they cannot utilize the blood glucose. They have to utilize breakdown of proteins and breakdown of fats. When fats are broken down, they form fatty acids. These fatty acids lead to the formation of ketone bodies. And if there is excess of ketone bodies, that leads to ketoacidosis. So this is true. The second one, which is cephalic phase of gastric secretion, is entirely under nervous control. This is also true, because the cephalic phase is when it is in your head. You're thinking about food, or you're having some thoughts about food. The food has not come in contact with your mouth or the rest of your gastrointestinal tract. So this is just the sight or the thought of food. It stimulates the nervous system and brings about gastric secretion. So this is true. The third statement, which says bile salts act in a manner similar to lipase. Now, this is the incorrect statement, because bile salts do not act in a manner similar to lipase. Lipase is the enzyme which acts on fats and causes chemical breakdown of fats, which is triglycerides, into fatty acids and glycerol. So fatty acids and glycerol. Now, bile salts help lipase to act. So what they do is they break down. So if there is some fatty food, they break down this fatty food into smaller particles and emulsify them. And then they help lipase to act on these smaller particles, because if this food was not broken down, lipase could only act on the surface up here, so the center would not be digested. So they do not act in a manner similar to lipase. So this is incorrect. However, if bile salts are not present, you can understand that fat digestion and absorption will not occur properly, because obviously lipase will not be able to act on all of the fat, so some of it will not be digested. So if lipase is absent or bile salts are absent, you can see in both cases fat digestion and absorption will not occur properly, but the action is not similar. Now let's look at this statement, which says absorption of water from undigested food occurs in the large intestine. Now this happens to be a true statement. The reason being that by the time the food comes into the large intestine, all of it which enters the large intestine is now just undigested food. Until the small intestine, all the digestion has occurred and absorption has occurred in the small intestine. So what is left over now is undigested food, and that is the undigested food which gets into the large intestine and forms feces. But that undigested food has a lot of water in it, and that water is absorbed from the undigested food in the large intestine, and hence this statement is true. Now let's look at this question, which tells you that Alice has not eaten for 6 days, and then you have to say which of the following reactions would not be of importance in providing ATP. So obviously her body has to use other methods to provide ATP because she's not eating. So let's look at the first one, which says glycogenolysis. The word lysis automatically tells you this is a catabolic reaction, which means glycogen, the stored glycogen, is broken down and it's going to make glucose. So this would occur, and hence it will provide ATP, because you're breaking down glycogen to provide glucose, and glucose is the one which will provide ATP. So this is one of the methods the body would use to provide ATP. Let's look at the next one, which says gluconeogenesis. That means new ways to produce glucose. So you're producing glucose through either protein breakdown or through fat breakdown, protein or fat breakdown. And these are ways that glucose can be produced. And when glucose is produced, that will provide ATP. So gluconeogenesis is another way to provide ATP. The third one is lipolysis. Again, another catabolic reaction. Again, lipolysis of fat, when fats are broken down, fats also can provide ATP, fatty acids, as I discussed in the last question in diabetics. This is one way to provide ATP. So lipolysis also occurs, which is why people who starve lose a lot of weight. Now the fourth one, this is one way that will not provide ATP because you're synthesizing protein. So when synthesis is occurring here, ATP is actually being used up in this process. And when someone is starved, at this point you don't want to be providing making protein, because the body is not getting enough food and you need ATP to be produced. So you don't have time to be making protein. Instead, you're breaking down protein, breaking down fat, breaking down carbohydrates to provide ATP. So in this situation, protein synthesis is not something the body will do. And secondly, protein synthesis is not something which will provide ATP. So because when you're synthesizing protein, you're actually using up ATP. So therefore, the answer to this question is the last choice.